Hey everyone, from Chickamauga and Chattanooga, I've made my way west across Tennessee to Shiloh. It's my first visit here to the battlefield, so I'm very excited to be here. Behind me is a reproduction of the simple Methodist church that stood here at the time of the battle, Shiloh Meeting House. It is, of course, painfully ironic that Shiloh is a Hebrew word meaning peaceful one, when this place was the site of one of the epic clashes of the Civil War. Nearly 110,000 Federal and Confederate soldiers fought here in these fields and woods in April 1862, and after 2 days of fierce combat, over 23,700 of them were killed, wounded, or missing. Shiloh was the Confederacy's first major attempt to reverse the tide of the war in the West after a series of damaging setbacks, from the loss of Kentucky to defeats at Forts Henry and Donelson to giving up half of Tennessee. The reason a battle was fought here at Shiloh is because the Tennessee River here at Pittsburgh Landing provided the Federals, under the command of Ulysses S. Grant, with an avenue of advance to threaten the important Confederate rail junction at Corinth, Mississippi, some 20 or so miles south of here. The rebel commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, was the highest ranking field officer in Confederate service. He'd come up with a plan to march his army up from Corinth and make a surprise attack on the enemy encamped here, drive them away from Pittsburgh Landing, and push them back to the west against Owl Creek, where the Yankees would be trapped and destroyed. Well, the rebels rolled forward and mostly succeeded in surprising the Yankees on the morning of Sunday, April 6th. Some Federal units on the periphery of the encampments did detect the Confederates, but they couldn't convince their superiors of the threat. Nevertheless, each Union division did have time to get under arms hurriedly before the Confederates were upon them. However, the Confederates relentlessly pushed forward, and throughout much of the day, the Federals struggled to form a continuous, coherent defensive line. The Army of the Tennessee's survival that day was due to the hard fighting of its men at places like here at the famous Hornet's Nest. The final Confederate attack on the first day of the battle was against this position, known as Grant's Last Line, near where the Visitor Center and National Cemetery stand today. Unfortunately for the rebels, the attack was launched against the strongest portion of this line, a point on the Union left wing where they had massed an impressive array of artillery, including big guns like this one. By that time, not only had Albert Sidney Johnston fallen, but the Confederate troops were exhausted, disorganized, low on ammunition, and darkness was rapidly approaching. So P.G.T. Beauregard, who had assumed command after Johnston's death, issued orders suspending any further attacks. One of the reasons Beauregard decided to call it a day on the evening of the 6th was because he was sure the Confederate Army could finish the job the next day. Even on the Federal side, nearly everyone thought Grant would pull out and withdraw during the night. But Grant was determined to stay and fight it out. In fact, with elements of a reinforcing army starting to arrive at Pittsburgh Landing, Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, Grant resolved to go over to the attack the next day and turn the tables on the rebels. That night, Grant kept vigil under a tree. That tree came down during a storm in 1909. Today, this pyramid of cannon marks the site of Grant's headquarters. In Stephen E. Woodworth's book, Shiloh, Confederate High Tide in the Heartland, he writes, The night of April 6-7 was a miserable one for the men of the armies gathered around Pittsburgh Landing. Throughout the night, the gunboats kept up a harassing fire, lobbing shells into Confederate lines. A Union soldier near the landing recalled that the boom of the guns, coming at approximately 15-minute intervals, seemed almost to lift him off the hay bale on which he was sleeping. Between the boom of the cannon, the men could perceive the aftermath of battle itself, with thousands of wounded men groaning on the battlefield or screaming under the ministrations of the surgeons and their bone saws. Grant found the only cabin at the landing in use as a field hospital, with a growing pile of amputated limbs outside it. The best shelter available was that of a nearby tree, which proved poor shelter indeed when shortly after midnight a heavy rain began to fall, with occasional showers of hail. On this night, generals suffered like privates. Grant was still standing under the tree, holding a lantern and puffing a cigar, when Sherman finally arrived to make his report. "Well, Grant," quipped the red-headed general, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," Grant replied. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." No decision of the battle was ultimately more decisive than that one. Indeed, it was the last truly significant decision of the battle. If Grant had decided to retreat across the river, as almost any other general would have done in his place, Shiloh would have been a major Union defeat. Because he determined to stay on the West Bank and fight it out, it became a Union victory. It probably saved Grant's career, and certainly put the Union in a much stronger position to win future victories in the West. And yet Grant seems scarcely to have considered doing anything else.